Concentration is an important aspect as we talk about the structure of agricultural markets. What concentration essentially is how much of the market share is controlled by the largest firms. And that's often being depicted by the concentration ratios. The concentration ratios basically say what is the percentage of sales as controlled by the four largest firms in the industry. And if those four largest companies have over 50% of the market shares, we consider that particular industry a highly concentrated market. An example of that would be the packing industry. The packing industry, there are four major firms and then a few small firms. But those four major firms own 80 to 90% of the market shares, meaning that they are a highly concentrated market. Well, what does that mean? What that essentially means is that there's less people to sell live cattle to, and then there's less people to buy beef from. So you're kind of limited on your choices. Another aspect of one of these highly concentrated markets is the cereal manufacturers. When it comes to cereal, there are four main cereal manufacturers in the United States that control over 90% of the cereal that is produced right here in the United States. So there's a very limiting place to sell your crops to if you're trying to sell it towards that cereal producers. And then there's very few places for you essentially to buy cereal from. There's very few companies. So we're also seeing some trends when it comes to this concentration in agricultural industries. Some of the trends are showing us that we're having rising concentration among firms. Firms are trying to obtain a larger amount of the market share, so we're seeing these rising concentrations across the industry. And that can be attributed due to product differentiation and advertising. They're creating these differentiated products, advertising and marketing their products well enough, it's increasing the market share, maybe pushing some companies out, and therefore causing concentrations to rise. We're also seeing that commodity type industries, commodity type companies have increased in concentration from the 1990s to the 2000s, indicating that there's less people buying and selling commodities, less individual firms. The same volume of commodities are still being bought and sold, but there's just less firms handling it. We're seeing these rising concentrations. We're also seeing that these concentrated markets, these concentrated industries are mainly in food processors. Well, that can be contributed to the fact of their advertising. They're effective at advertising, increasing their market share, making them a highly concentrated market or more concentrated than these commodity types. While these commodity types are rising in the trend, we're still seeing that there's still mainly food processors is where the concentrated markets are being held at. And then we're also seeing a trend of these conglomerate food processors. A conglomerate food processor is a food processor that works in seemingly unrelated markets. Nestle is a good example of that. Just to name off a couple things that Nestle produces, they produce chocolate and water. Bottled water and chocolate. Those two seem to be almost on opposite ends of the spectrum. One is a very healthy beverage. One can often be perceived as a not so healthy snack. So they're working in two seemingly unrelated markets as well as a lot of other markets in this one company, making them this conglomerate food processor. And we're starting to see more food processors trying to become these conglomerate food processors and getting into these seemingly unrelated markets. Another thing that we're kind of beginning to see, or that we must be aware of, is whenever we're talking about procurement and concentration. So whenever we have starting to get generally higher concentration in procurement, there's less firms buying from farmers, so we're having these higher concentrations in procurement. So what that means is that there's fewer processors that buy from many, and there's fewer processors that sell to many. Remember that whenever we talked about that marketing channel, we said the processors was the smallest group. Well, they're buying from basically many assemblers, and they're selling to many wholesalers. And as we keep going on, we're seeing these food processors become more concentrated, meaning that there's less firms buying from a lot of firms, there's less processors buying from many firms, many assemblers, and now there's less processors selling to many wholesalers. So that's becoming another thing that we're learning in the agriculture industry, is that there's fewer processors and they're buying from many and selling to many. Well, Why does this matter? Well, as we're starting to get into these concentrated industries, and there's few firms out there, we're starting to get into a different type of market structure. We're no longer in perfect competition where no one buyer or seller can influence the market. Now, as we become highly concentrated, we're getting into these type of industries where one big buyer or one big seller can really influence the market. One beef packing plant can heavily influence the market if they choose to do so. So, as we get into that market structure, all of these agribusinesses that are in these highly concentrated industries must always consider everybody else's reactions. This is often known as a game theory that's often discussed in other economics classes. So to kind of give you an example, if one industry or if one company decides, hey, we're going to lower our prices. We're going to lower our prices and increase sales. Well, if there's 4 major companies all acting in the same industry, and one of those companies decide, I'm going to lower my prices and increase my sales. They lower their prices, it increases their sales, but the other 3 companies are also going to follow suit. They're going to also lower their commodity or lower their prices, and whenever they do that, then everybody basically equalizes out and goes back to the original amount of sales. So you've always got to take into consideration what the other ones are going to do. Another major aspect is whenever it comes to buying of these agricultural commodities. If a new low-cost producer comes in, if somebody can come in and create a brand new plant and they become a low-cost producer, and they can buy commodities at a higher price from all of the other producers, so a low-cost processor can now buy at a higher price from the producers or the assemblers, that's going to begin to drive the high-cost processors out. So as we move to these highly concentrated industries, we must really consider what's going to happen if one of these players one of these big players decides to do something. Well, how is that going to affect everybody else in the industry?